Thank you, David. It's always the challenge. The real challenge of giving these lectures is when anybody mentions Volume 2 of the First World War. That is, I hope, the last time it will be mentioned today, and nobody is allowed to ask me when Volume 2 will be delivered. I want to begin instead by thinking about canons. The S is important because the plural of a canon, meaning a gun, is still canon. Canons with an S could refer to a group of Anglican clergymen, in this case it doesn't, or it could refer to authoritative lists of works that form a basis for judgment and set the standard in the field. And in this case that is exactly what I'm referring to. There is a debate, and I'm sure you're well aware of it, conducted in places like the New York Review of Books about the status of the canon in English literature. The presumption, therefore, of a canon is that it consists of a small coterie of largely white, largely male, largely European, possibly even solely Anglophone writers. And critics of the canon in English literature argue reasonably enough that these great writers, these ones who are admitted to the canon, didn't actually exist in a vacuum and still don't exist in a vacuum. As we've mentioned corpus, I should of course quickly say that Christopher Marlowe wrote most of Shakespeare, and that therefore you need to understand Marlowe in order to understand Shakespeare properly. And that much of that argument, of course, may be extended further, and of course even chronologically, that the canon should admit new entrants rather than be a closed book. I say all that because strategy 2 has its canon. Karl von Clausewitz, Antoine-Henri Jomini, Alfred Thayer Mahon, Julian Corbett. Like great authors, however, they too did not blaze in a firmament devoid of context. They were not the only stars, even if the other stars were a bit less bright. They stood, to mix my metaphors, on the shoulders of others. They derived much of their thinking from others. And they, I suspect, even more than the authors of great novels, were shaped by the times in which they lived. They were, after all, when they were dealing with the subject of strategy and of war more generally, they were caught up in the great political debates of their own days and developed their thinking as a result of that interaction with reality. If you read Clausewitz's On War, and I'm afraid, perhaps predictably, there's going to be more than one or two references to Clausewitz this evening, Clausewitz mentions only two of his near contemporaries. Jomini is one, and Bülow is the other, and he does so simply for the purposes of abusing them. He was clearly not a pleasant man, not a man given to generosity of spirit. He actually derived quite a few of his leading ideas from both of them, including what he had to say about mass on the decisive point, about the strength of operations on interior lines, and even one of his most famous concepts, the idea of the culminating point of victory. Even more significant, however, precisely because his debt to them seems greater, is his total failure to mention those on whom he relied even more. Authors like Guibert, Barenhorst, and Roel von Lilienstein. Mahon was a bit more honest and a bit more open and a bit more generous than Clausewitz. But if you think too of the impact of the influence of Sea Power on History, published in 1890, that also is too often seen as a founding document in naval strategy, as though it suddenly appeared from nowhere and has never subsequently been overtaken, or at least never subsequently overtaken in terms of the immediate context of its impact, immediately in the run-up to the First World War, and in shaping what we now think of as Mahonian ideas thereafter. Indeed, Mahon's book is paralleled in some ways with Clausewitz's On War, doesn't really match it, but it has that status in relation to war at sea that On War has in relation to war on land, or even to war more generally. And yet here in Britain, the Kalam Brothers, John and Philip, had been developing concepts of maritime strategy since 1867. Who now reads Kalam's 2 volumes on naval warfare? Is it still in print? Somebody's going to tell me it is. But let's say, for the sake of the argument this evening, it isn't still in print, where, of course, Mahon, perhaps Mahon isn't in print, Mahon must be in print. Mahon, unlike Clausewitz, at least acknowledged his debt to others. He did acknowledge that he had read the Journal of the Royal United Services Institute, the debates that were conducted within its pages, conducted by the Kalam Brothers, by John Lawton, James Thursfield, Sydenham Clark, and various other people who are now almost completely forgotten. And, of course, Mahon paid some obeisance to the fact that he probably never would have written but for the backing of the then director of the Naval War College, Admiral Stephen Luce, who was perhaps as influential in shaping Mahon as Scharnhorst had been in shaping Clausewitz. The notion that there is a canon in strategic thought, at least in the English-speaking world, is attributable to the founding text of strategic studies, Edward Mead Earle's Makers of Modern Strategy, a volume which I remember rushing to get from Heffer's in about 1970, when it had just been reprinted. The Makers of Modern Strategy bears early testimony to the value of collaboration in scholarship, a process now venerated by research councils, but in 1943, when the book was published, rare among scholars. The Makers of Modern Strategy was the product of a seminar in American foreign policy and security issues organized by Earle at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton in 1941. Its subtitle was revealing: From Machiavelli to Hitler. The titles of its chapters were all named individuals, with the exception of 2, one by Ropp on continental doctrines of sea power, and one by Alexander Kiralfy, whom I've never heard of otherwise except in that context, and somebody else will tell me how important he is, on Japanese naval strategy. Otherwise, Earle's contributors established who was in the canon and who, by implication, was out of the canon. For example, the chapter which followed that on Japanese naval strategy was called Dewey, Mitchell, Seversky, Theories of Air Warfare. In other words, theories of air warfare were associated with 3 thinkers only. To some extent, we continue that game today, not least in relation to air warfare. To Dewey and Mitchell, we now add John Boyd and John Warden. But in other respects, we have at least implicitly recognized the intellectual weaknesses and the self-serving patterns of a focus on famous individuals. Earle's generation was naturally enough preoccupied with the Nazis. So the chapter on geopolitics was simply headed Haushofer, with no reference to the fact that geopolitics owed its origins to a British founder, Halford Mackinder, even if he was an Oxford man, or to its best-known German originator, Friedrich Ratzel. Earle's epilogue was simply called Hitler, the Nazi concept of war, to continue the general thread. And it rested on the premise which we will probably actually not find unexceptionable today, that although, these are Earle's words, although Goebbels and Goering played their parts, and although the Wehrmacht always stood in the foreground, it was Hitler who set the pace, called the tune, and reaped the rewards. Just over 40 years later, in 1986, Peter Perret published an updated version of The Makers of Modern Strategy, and its subtitle revealed a difference. Instead of saying from Machiavelli to Hitler, it said from Machiavelli to the nuclear age. It changed from the individual to the collective, from personalities to schools of thought. The change in this structure was evident at about the chronological point of 1900, the entry to the 20th century. So Mahon still got a chapter to himself, and significantly, Julian Corbett, of whom more anon, was excluded. But of the 20th century thinkers, only Littlehart and de Gaulle figured in what came to be 13 chapters, devoted essentially to 86 years, given the publication date of 1986. Since then, others have also recognised that the canon needs widening, and that other strategic thinkers need including, and that it might be more sensible to talk about schools of thought rather than about individual writers. But I have laboured the issue of the canon in strategic thought precisely to introduce the first of the problems with which strategy confronts us. The implication in setting Clausewitz or Mahon in the context of their contemporaries, even if those contemporaries produced works of lesser stature than On War or than the influence of sea power on history, is that both those books need to be understood as products of their own times. Both Clausewitz and Mahon were engaged in debates on contemporary policy. For Clausewitz, these were literally matters of life and death, of the survival of Prussia as an independent state, or the alternative of its subordination to the person he called the god of war, that was to say, Napoleon. War for Clausewitz was existential and deeply necessary, and his distance from his own king, Friedrich Wilhelm III, arose precisely because the monarch seemed less sure of that. Indisputably, at least in my judgment, even if not of those of one or two of the scholars of the 1990s, Martin van Creveld, John Keegan and Mary Cowlaw among them, indisputably, Clausewitz has enormously important things to say to us about war in 2011. And that is precisely the measure of his genius. But if we are to understand what those things are, or at least what Clausewitz meant by what he said, rather than what other people believe he meant by what he said, rather than what other people think what he said, then we need the context of early 19th century Prussia, the context set by his other writings, and the context of the writings provided by his contemporaries. This is too often not the view of those who study strategy for application in the contemporary world, and who use the canon of strategic thought to sustain their arguments. Strategic studies is all too prone to use Clausewitz and Mahon and the others in the canon as a collection of quotations subject to to arbitrary selection, or perhaps self-selection in terms of the interests of the authors of strategic studies, subject to prejudice and preference, which can divorce precisely what is being said from the context in which it is being placed. The essential premise of strategic studies is that war across time has sufficient similarity, that one war is sufficiently like another, and sufficiently unlike any other form of human activity to provide us with generic arguments. In 1992, a much venerated professor of strategy at the US Naval War College, Michael Handel, published a book called Masters of War, Sun Tzu, Clausewitz, and Jomini. Between then and his premature death in 2001, Handel's book went through 2 more editions, tripling in size as it did so. I remember arriving in Oxford when the 3rd edition had just come out, and I said to one of my research students, "Do I need to read the new edition?" To which she replied, "Yes, it is 3 times the length. It must have more in it." Masters of War rested on the presumption that there existed a canon in strategic thought, although, to be fair, Handel widened the canon beyond his original triumvirate to admit Machiavelli and Mao Zedong. In other words, Handel's book embraced authors separated by 2,000 years of history and 20,000 miles of distance, and yet its contents were structured thematically by topic, dealing with issues like the primacy of politics and war termination, as though each was constant across time and across distance. As Handel put it in his opening chapter, the underlying logic of human nature and by extension of political action, has not changed throughout history. Handel's purpose was to minimize difference in the belief that, to quote him, ultimately the logic and rational direction of war are universal, and there is no such thing as an exclusively Western or Eastern approach to politics and strategy. There is only an effective or ineffective, rational or non-rational manifestation of politics or strategy. Handel is not alone among current scholars in strategic studies. Colin Gray begins his book on modern strategy, published in 1999, with the assertion, printed in italics, just in case you're in danger of mistaking the message, with the assertion, there is an essential unity to all strategic experience in all periods of history because nothing vital to the nature and function of war and strategy changes. The problem with claims like those of Handel and Gray is that strategy is a word of much more recent coinage than its use by strategic commentators and even historians sometimes suggests. It was, above all, a product of the late 18th century Enlightenment and its impact on French military thought. And even then, it did not quickly enter common currency. Napoleon barely uses the word. He talks either of policy, of la politique, or of grand tactics. It was the attempts preeminently by Jomini and Clausewitz to give shape to understanding what Napoleon had done to the conduct of war which gave the word strategy currency. So one question that we have to ask ourselves is whether a civilization without a word for a concept can possess the concept in the first place. In 1976, another member of the Strategic Studies fraternity, Edward Luttwak, wrote a book on the grand strategy of the Roman Empire, which was attacked almost immediately by Latin scholars for precisely this reason. A criticism whose validity Luttwak acknowledged in 2009 when he wrote a more defensible study of the grand strategy of the Byzantine Empire. More defensible because at least there is a Byzantine work called Strategikon. Luttwak is a pillar of the strategic studies community, but he and others have shaped the debates conducted not just by those who work in strategic studies, but increasingly even by historians themselves. Having been attacked by students of Roman history, those Roman historians now themselves increasingly refer to Luttwak and engage in debates with him. And one of the most distinguished of military historians alive today, Geoffrey Parker, has written a book on the grand strategy of Philip II. The problem is not just that strategy was not a word used before the late 18th century. It is also that it has been used in very different ways since the late 18th century. Clausewitz defines strategy as the use of the battle for the purposes of the war. And for most of his 19th century successors, that would have been relatively uncontentious. But after 1918, 20th century thinkers, like Little Hart, corpus man, so I have to mention him, like Little Hart, saw strategy as concerned with the use of the war for the purposes of policy. And since 1945, many definitions of strategy do not even mention the word war at all. Moreover, as we have widened and elevated the definitions of strategy beyond the more restricted sphere of military operations, so strategy itself has been shaped by fresh actors and fresh concepts. Clausewitz acknowledged, to give an example of fresh actors, the role of the people in war, as his development of the Trinity recognized. But we have put more weight on the people in conflict since 2001, not least thanks to a single overused phrase, war among the people, a phrase which I increasingly suspect Sir Rupert Smith must regret at times having coined. And as far as concepts are concerned, international law was given short shrift by Clausewitz, but is today a core component in the making of strategy. and indeed those with legal training, from Julian Corbett in 1911 to Philip Bobbitt in our own day, have played important roles in shaping strategic thought. Strategy rests on an awareness of history, not just because Clausewitz uses the word differently from how we use it, not just because when he talks about strategy, he does not mean what students of contemporary strategy imagine he means, but also because strategic thought is, or at least was, built on history as its core discipline. When the chair in the history of war was established at Oxford in 1909, its purpose was as much to dedicate its holders' time to contemporary war, as I note at my cost, as to wars in the past. The disciplinary distinction between political science and history had not yet been made. Nor was Spencer Wilkinson, the first holder of the chair, the only person to span the relationship between past and present in the Oxford History faculty. In 1914, with the outbreak of the First World War, the members of that faculty took it upon it themselves to produce a series of over 80 pamphlets to explain why Britain had entered the Great War. So Wilkinson was not unusual among historians in using his knowledge of military history, in his particular case military history, to illuminate and understand the wars of his own day. He was also entirely typical of strategic thinkers. Jomini and Clausewitz did the same thing. Both wrote more military history than they wrote military theory. The same could be said of Mahon, of Corbett, of Fuller, Little Hart, and almost every other member of the strategic canon up until 1945. The canon, in other words, rested on a dialogue between past and present. Indeed, there is a further point. Most writing on strategy, at least most that enter the canon, not only confine itself to the past and to the present, but also specifically eschewed any discussion about the future. Neither Jomini nor Clausewitz, neither Mahon nor Corbett talked about what might happen over the horizon. This creates an inherent tension within strategic thought. The presumption is that strategy has some predictive value and so is orientated towards the future. This expectation survives despite the fact that strategy has an extraordinarily poor record as a predictor of outcomes. Strategy, as practiced by general staffs, involves planning. But general staffs will quickly tell you plans do not survive the first contact with the enemy. The tendency of strategic theory, if it rests on the future, or a study of the future, or a futurology, if there is such a word, is to fall flat on its face and to descend into fiction. And indeed, I'm reminded of my time here in Cambridge when I ran a war studies seminar in 1982, when we invited General Sir John Hackett to speak about his new book, The Third World War, The Untold Story. Hackett's book was a fictionalized account of war between NATO and the Warsaw Pact 5 years hence. And Hackett's own status as a former NATO commander gave it authority. It was a bestseller, serialized as far as I can remember in the national press. But the core point now in reflecting on that book is that the Third World War didn't happen, that it was indeed fiction in two senses of the word. Fiction in the way in which it was put together, and fiction in terms of the event that it was trying to describe. Moreover, one can quickly say, Hackett's The Third World War is not now in the strategic studies canon. And if you want to find a copy, your best bet will probably be an Oxfam bookshop or the next church jumble sale. In the nuclear age, two things happened to strategy. First, there was a presumption shaped by the two world wars that technology determined not only the character of war, but also its direction. J.F.C. Fuller, whose arguments in the 1920s pivoted on the mechanization of war, was a forerunner in this field. Secondly, Strategy, particularly when it fell into the hands of academics, as it increasingly did after about 1960, aspired to be a science, a product of calculation. History lost its purchase in strategic studies, and game theory, especially in the work of Thomas Schelling, took its place. Interestingly, now that we have real wars to contend with in Iraq and Afghanistan, as opposed to theoretical wars, history has regained some purchase, especially through the revival of interest in counterinsurgency. Consider the impact in current debates on counterinsurgency of John Nagle's eating soup with a knife or David Kilcullen's accidental guerrilla. Nagle's argument depends on an analysis, in my view a somewhat selective and rose-tinted analysis, of the British Army's experience in Malaya. Kilcullen's book works so well because he tells stories. He relates his own experiences to theory, the past to the present. And the same thing is evident in the US Doctrinal Manual, Field Manual 3-24, published in December 2006, which rests heavily on the work of David Galula, whose study for RAND was based on what he had learned from Algeria in the 1950s. Strategic thought does best, it would seem, when it harnesses an awareness of the past to the present, or at most to the very immediate future. So the question that arises is, if strategic thought is of no or only limited predictive value, what is its purpose? Why do we need it? One answer is that strategy is about understanding before it is about solutions. That is at bottom why we still read Clausewitz and we don't read Jomini or his 19th century successors. Clausewitz questions his own assumptions and generalizations. Most military writers, begging the forgiveness of one or two present here, most military writers naturally do the opposite, to find more evidence to confirm their conclusions, conclusions which they come to far too rapidly, and present companies accepted, of course. The value of history to strategy, therefore, is its capacity to help us understand change more than it is to understand continuity, whatever Colin Gray or Edward Lookback might suggest. Let me quote a historian to support what I'm saying. Marc Bloch, the great French medieval economic historian and founder of the Annales School, served in 2 world wars and lost his life to a Gestapo firing squad in 1944. In his book analysing the defeat of 1940, strange defeat in the English translation, which was of course published posthumously, he asked himself why French staff education, before both 1914 and 1940, had got its preparation for the next war so badly wrong. His answer was that although it had used, in his view sensibly, military history to study war, it had done so in order to stress continuities, not change. Bloch wrote, to quote him, "History is in its essentials the science of change. The lesson it teaches us is not that what happened yesterday will necessarily happen tomorrow, or that the past will go on repeating itself. By examining how and why yesterday will differ from the day before, it can reach conclusions which will enable it to foresee how tomorrow will differ from yesterday." You may feel that all this is very academic. We come back to the problem that those staff college students of the 19th, 20th, and possibly even still of the 21st centuries have with Clausewitz, that in the end, they need solutions. Understanding is all very well, but strategy is also pragmatic. It belongs in the realm of action. Those who have written works on strategy that belong in the canon often have had experience of actual war. Clausewitz had, Jomini had, Fuller had, Little Hart had. But they haven't themselves been practitioners of strategy. Those who have practiced strategy in its 20th century sense, as opposed to its 19th century more operational sense, have been heads of state. Earl, writing in the Second World War in his Makers of Modern Strategy book, was preoccupied with Hitler. Mein Kampf is not, however, in the canon of strategic studies. Elliot Cohen in his study of Supreme Command, published in 2002, took as his case studies Abraham Lincoln, Georges Clemenceau, Winston Churchill, and David Ben-Gurion. None of these is famous for having produced a book on strategy. Indeed, in some respects, their thinking was strategic, I mean A in a negative sense, strategic and certainly unscientific. Lincoln, as he grew increasingly frustrated with General George B. McClellan, fulminated that the generals and the public, to quote him, have got the idea in their heads that we're going to get out of this fix somehow by strategy. The great strategist of the American Civil War, in the eyes of many, was actually Robert E. Lee. He lost. Lincoln developed a contempt for strategy and won. Churchill did read works of strategy as a young subaltern in the 4th Hussars. But in 1940, he rejected the rational option to make peace with Hitler on terms that would guarantee the independence of Britain, if not of Europe, and chose instead the romantic option, and indeed the morally correct one, to fight on. As David Reynolds has written, in 1940, Churchill and his colleagues made the right decision, but they did so for the wrong reasons. So there is a distinction between strategic thought and strategy in practice. That is one reason why strategic thought is focused on past and current practice. It reflects on present events and relates them to the past, so establishing continuities where there are continuities and recognizing change where there is change. But the making of strategy is not just a dialogue between theorists and practitioners. It is also a dialogue between practitioners, and especially between civilians and the military. It is therefore a product of a three-way exchange. Theorists and academics on the one hand, civilians, both elected and bureaucratic, on the other, and the military. The military is central to this triumvirate. In modern Western societies, the military are more likely than the civilians to be familiar with the canon of strategic theory. They are more likely than Barack Obama or David Cameron to have read Clausewitz or Galula. But in the hierarchy of democratic societies, the military is, at least normatively, deemed to be subordinate to the political. This subordination rests on a historical fear and on a theoretical misapprehension. The historical fear is that of a military coup. In Britain, the memory of Cromwell's major generals, apparently still alive. In France, the Third Republic's fear of Bonapartism. In Germany, the legend of the stab in the back and the so-called revolution from above in 1918. All these things stoke that legacy, that fear of the possibility of a coup. That fear looks increasingly perverse for two reasons. The most obvious is that in most advanced Western democracies, the danger of a military coup is fast reducing to zero. This is a case where a sense of continuity from the past is less helpful than an awareness of change. In the 17th century, and in more backward countries as recently as the 20th century, the military had the capacity to hijack the running of the state. In the 21st century, it increasingly cannot, because it lacks the sophistication and range of competencies required to do so. The second and less obvious reason is that when military coups have occurred, they have rarely been prompted by a military desire to usurp the functions of strategy making, rarely been prompted by a desire to take over grand strategy. The context for a coup has more often been domestic politics than international politics, as we possibly see in Egypt. Or we don't see, we shall see. But the result is that a norm applicable in one area of state activity has pernicious effects in another, possibly to the detriment of national security. The theoretical misapprehension is the notion that war is an instrument of policy, a continuation of policy by other means. The implication in that phrase, that well-worn phrase, the implication of continuity, is nonsense. War, particularly for European states since 1945, is a break in policy. We are not fascist states for whom the struggle is perpetual and for whom the rhetoric of war obfuscates the distinction between war and peace. Nor are we domestic monarchies, constantly seeking to consolidate our frontiers against the depredations of our neighbours or to add to our territories. Politics in the Western world today are shaped by a presumption of peace. We luxuriate in the legacy of the Enlightenment and believe, perhaps naively, that peace is the normal condition in society. Indeed, that is precisely why strategy has a moral component, as Churchill laid bare. War, whatever the current jargon so misleading and unhelpful it suggests, cannot, at least for a state that is moral, be discretionary or a matter of choice. War is necessary, or it is nothing. Indeed, the paradox is that what we have come to call existential war can be so necessary that we must and can find ourselves fighting it to the finish. As Churchill put it, if this Long Island story of ours is to end at last, let it end only when each one of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground. That is vocabulary redolent of Clausewitz's chilling call to arms in February 1812, when he summoned the German nation, not the Prussian king with whom he had lost patience, to rise up against Napoleon and to go down fighting. Better that, he said, than to lose your identity through dishonour. Significantly, that was the Clausewitz whom Hitler quoted in Mein Kampf and who was admitted to the Nazi pantheon. As the denouement in Berlin in 1945 shows, when war begins, it assumes a life of its own, such that politics and policies are subordinated to war, not vice versa, and that becomes more true the more protracted the war. Even if wars are waged successfully, they rarely deliver the political results which the eventual victor was seeking when war was initiated. Bismarck's wars of 1866 and 1870 may have done so, but they were exceptional, not least because they were short. Bush's wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have not, and the capacity of either Bush or now Obama to shape and direct them is extraordinarily limited. Obama marked his presidency by abandoning the so-called global war on terror. But institutionally, the global war on terror is still with us. Guantanamo Bay has not closed. Immigration controls and airport security continue to annoy us. And in some respects, the global war on terror has expanded with the increasing frequency of US drone attacks across the border into Pakistan in defiance of national sovereignty. Policy needs to recognise the character of the war in which it is engaged and therefore may have to adapt itself to the war rather than to adapt the war to policy. These are points spelt out by Clausewitz in his fullest discussion of these issues, that in Book 8, Chapter 6 of On War. As he puts it, when people talk, as they often do, about harmful political influence on the management of war, they are not really saying what they mean. Their quarrel should be with the policy itself, not with its influence. If the policy is right, that is, successful, any intentional effect it has on the conduct of the war can only be to the good. If it has the opposite effect, the policy itself is wrong. Only if statesmen look to certain military moves and actions to produce effects that are foreign to their nature, that is, foreign to the nature of military operations, do political decisions influence operations for the worse. In the same way as a man who has not fully mastered a foreign language sometimes fails to express himself correctly, so statesmen often issue orders that defeat the purpose they are meant to serve. Time and again that has happened, which demonstrates that a certain grasp of military affairs is vital for those in charge of general policy. We do not expect our statesmen to possess a certain grasp of military affairs. So how can we ensure that they embrace policies whose aims are compatible with what military operations can deliver, i.e., with the ways and means to deliver on those ends. This is an issue which is becoming more complex, not less. As Clausewitz, the son of an officer in Frederick the Great's army, observed, the unity of political and military authority in the single person of the king could produce an ideal result. In states of increasing sophistication, and democracies to boot, power is not consolidated in this way. And the problem has been further compounded by the formation of alliances. NATO has a lot to answer for. Its aggregation of military capability has not been matched by a capacity, particularly since 1990, to develop and coordinate strategy. Indeed, its creation has led many of the United States' allies to abandon the capacity to make strategy, most notably and understandably in Germany in the wake of the Second World War, but also, and albeit less overtly, here in the United Kingdom. It is striking that France, having removed itself from NATO's military structure until 2008, managed to maintain both a stronger sense of its own national interest and, as a corollary, a much more developed awareness of and debate about strategy. Of course, personality, particularly in a national context, can dominate strategy and even hijack the institutions designed to make strategy. De Gaulle was a case in point, and so was Churchill in the Second World War. But making the personality the solution is fraught on two counts. In the First World War, the Germans concluded by about 1916, given the weakness of the Kaiser as the supreme commander, that they needed a Führer, the better to achieve the civil military coordination they felt they needed to make strategy. So the cult of the Führer as an abstract concept was well developed before the Führer himself had emerged. At this level, Hitler could seem to be the solution to Clausewitz's challenge. Most states, thank goodness, are unlikely to produce a Hitler or to go down that route. But they're also unlikely to be confident of matching the personality to the circumstances of war on demand as Churchill matched the circumstances of 1940. Having a prime minister who has the right temperament to be a wartime leader is a matter almost of chance and certainly of contingency. We therefore need institutional frameworks to direct strategy. Clausewitz's alternative solution, that is, alternative to the idea of a monarch who combined civil and military authority, was to make the commander-in-chief a member of the cabinet, so that he and it could share in each other's counsels and decisions. Clausewitz, of course, did not mean a cabinet in our sense. He was talking about the private office of the king, the body of the king's personal advisers. And he knew from his own experience of Prussia's drastic and dramatic defeat in 1806 that the cabinet could prove useless if the king himself was useless. In other words, personality could still undermine institutional strength. The possession of a cabinet in a modern sense does not remove that danger, as the evidence presented by 3 cabinet secretaries to the Chilcot inquiry last week made plain. Lords Turnbull and Wilson stated that the Prime Minister did not present papers to the cabinet in the run-up to the war, and that as a result, the cabinet did not take proper decisions. Lord Turnbull, when asked what options the cabinet had in March 2003, replied they were pretty much imprisoned. He went on, there was a mismatch between what the Prime Minister's thinking was and how much he shared with his colleagues. By summer 2002, he had largely made up his mind when his colleagues were a long way behind. He was very reluctant to discuss the military options and the strategic choices. Discussions of military options were promised but did not happen. Contrast this evidence with the assertion in one of the most important works in the strategic studies canon, and one written by a Briton to boot. that is to say, Julian Corbett's Some Principles of Maritime Strategy, published in 1911. Corbett wrote, "Conference is always necessary, and for conference to succeed, there must be a common vehicle of expression and common plane of thought. It is for this essential preparation that theoretical study alone can provide, and herein lies its practical value for all who aspire to the higher responsibilities of the imperial service." Empire meant for Britain that strategy was as much a peacetime activity, or at least an activity to be conducted in periods of ostensible peace, as it was a wartime activity. The need to match imperial security, maritime capability, and overstretched economic resources resulted in 1902 in the creation of the Committee of Imperial Defence, a body chaired by the Prime Minister, which brought together the relevant cabinet ministers and the professional heads of the Army and the Navy, or let's get it in the right order of seniority, the Navy and the Army. The Committee of Imperial Defence was not an executive committee, but an advisory committee of the Cabinet. And when the First World War broke out, its functions were folded into the Cabinet. In the Second World War, it was effectively obliterated by Churchill's symbiotic relationship with the Chiefs of Staff Committee, much to the fury of the principal author and advocate of the Committee of Imperial Defence, Lord Hankey. But the British capacity to make grand strategy so impressed the United States, which convinced itself that American strategy had been perverted by Britain's institutional strength in strategy making, that in 1947 the United States created the National Security Council. The US National Security Council, like the United Kingdom's Committee of Imperial Defence, has had its ups and downs, flourishing under Eisenhower, not least thanks to his commitment to it, and marginalised in the era of Bush the Younger and, I suspect, of Obama. In May 2010, the United Kingdom created its own National Security Council, and we are very far from being the only country in the Western world that has opted to go down this route in the last 2 or 3 years. A corollary of the weaknesses of NATO as a military alliance is perhaps an increasing recognition of the members of that alliance of the need to renationalise the capacity to identify core national interests and to shape strategy in order to defend them. Given what I've said so far, it follows that I welcome these developments, but the key questions that follow from the creation of a National Security Council still await resolution. First of all, there is the point that if a committee is deliberative, if you have a committee, its purpose is deliberative, drawing on a varying range of expertise. The heads of the intelligence services, the chief of the defence staff, are present on a footing which is in this respect, that of deliberation, one of equality. If the principle of military subordination to civil control extends to the deliberative stage in strategy making, the iteration between policy and strategy will be lost. The professional heads need to be fully implicated in the thinking which leads to the decision. Secondly, that deliberative stage needs to be informed by strategic theory. That does not mean, you'll be relieved to know, no doubt, that academics should be on the National Security Council, but it does mean that the Secretariat should be staffed by those informed in strategic thinking, by those who are themselves capable of it, or supported by their own independent group of strategic thinkers. And thirdly, the head of state must chair the National Security Council and give it his imprimatur or her imprimatur and commitment, as Eisenhower did, or as Lloyd George or Thatcher did in their respective war cabinets in the First World War or in the Falklands War. In Britain, only the last of these conditions has been met. Moreover, the biggest challenge to the National Security Council as an institution arises precisely from the critical role of the Prime Minister and of the personal preferences which he exercises and which his successors may or may not exercise. Its status will be lost if the Prime Minister of the day does not see it as his responsibility to chair it, and so implicitly downgrades its authority. This is particularly likely to occur in the context of wars which are not fought as wars of national survival. The vocabulary of today's conflicts, to which I've already referred, wars of choice or discretionary wars, militates against a Prime Minister giving national security as much as he gives the danger of double-dip recession, the health service or education. In the United States, Obama seems more concerned about the latter than about the war in Afghanistan, and it tells, both in the lack of NATO strategy in Afghanistan and in the relative decline of US authority in international affairs. But there is also a reverse danger, that the National Security Council, not least by dint of the authority which the head of state gives it, sees all problems as security problems, that the National Security Council trumps the Cabinet, that the economic, health service and educational issues are enfolded as means to the end of security, that every problem a government confronts becomes a threat rather than a challenge, and that the answer to too many threats is the implicit or even explicit use of force. This is precisely why strategic theory needs to be brought back into the debate. Strategic theory began its life very specifically with the problem of war, not of 21st century definitions of national security, however broad they might be. To be sure, the notion of ground strategy, or even of national strategy, has now accustomed us to the idea that strategy needs to be developed in peace as well as in war. But when the idea of ground strategy was first adumbrated in the 1920s, it was presumed that its purpose in peace was to prepare for war, not to unfold peacetime activities like diplomacy, trade relations, immigration policies, or whatever, within a security envelope. This matters because there is a key distinction between strategy in peace and strategy in war. It is in strategy in peace that we can argue that policy dominates. It is, relatively speaking, unilateral. Sure, it is subject to the cut and thrust of domestic party politics, but it is still reflective of the will of the elected government of the day. It has to deal with priorities in the exercise of economic choice to choose between, for example, health on the one hand and defence on the other. Strategy in war, however, is in a different place, even if that is also a matter of prioritisation. War is not unilateral. It is an interactive relationship with the enemy, a contested space, where contingency, real-time intelligence and fleeting opportunities are central to decisions which often have to be immediate and even seemingly instinctive. This was the space which Churchill filled. One of the challenges for strategy making today is that we are in a twilight zone, not sure whether we are at war or at peace, and so unsure about what strategy is trying to do, and unsure about the position of who understands strategy, of those who understand strategy, whether strategic thinkers or military practitioners, and unsure about their position in the councils of government. The first step in resolving that dilemma is to understand strategy in the first place. If that means reverting to the canon, however much that canon may embody the ideas of dead, white and even military males of European stock, then that is not too bad a place to begin. But it can only be a beginning, because an awareness of the continuities brought about by a knowledge of their texts is no more than a departure point for understanding what is new and different in our own day. Thank you very much.